The summer of 2008 was etched in my memory, a time when the world seemed both vast and intimate. I was just a child then, wide-eyed and curious, with Europe as my playground. Our family, consisting of my parents and me, along with our 2 loyal canine companions, had always been adventurers at heart. Every summer, we'd pack our car to the brim with essentials and set off on journeys that would become the stories of our lives. That particular year, our compass pointed towards Luxembourg, a gem nestled in the heart of Western Europe. It was a country I'd only seen in atlases, its borders embraced by Belgium, Germany, and France. As we crossed into Luxembourg, I pressed my face against the car window, marveling at how the landscape transformed. Gone were the flat expanses I was accustomed to. In their place rose a terrain of undulating hills and mysterious forests. My father, a man with salt and pepper hair and a penchant for spontaneity, was at the wheel. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he navigated the winding roads. "You see, son," he'd say, his voice carrying over the hum of the engine, "Luxembourg may be small, but it's got a big heart, and mountains. Did you know that?" I shook my head, absorbing this new information like a sponge. My mother, seated beside him, would chime in with fascinating tidbits from the guidebook spread across her lap. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight filtering through the trees, creating a halo effect that made her look almost magical. As we drove deeper into the country, the mountains began to make their presence known. They weren't the towering giants of the Alps, but rather proud, ancient guardians of the land. Their slopes were cloaked in dense forests, occasionally parting to reveal charming villages or solitary castles perched on rocky outcrops. Our dogs, Max and Luna, a pair of energetic golden retrievers, whined softly from the back seat, eager for their next adventure. I patted their heads, sharing in their anticipation. The car was filled with the scent of the picnic my mother had packed, fresh bread, local cheeses, and the promise of sweet pastries for dessert. As the day wore on, the familiar gave way to the unknown. We had long since left the main roads, following smaller paths that snaked through the countryside. The paved surfaces gradually turned to gravel, then to dirt tracks barely wide enough for our vehicle. "Let's explore here," my father suddenly announced, pulling the car to a stop at a seemingly random spot along the road. It was a decision that would change everything. We stepped out of the car, stretching our legs after hours of driving. The air was different here, crisp and laden with the scent of pine and wild herbs. Max and Luna bounded out, their tails wagging furiously as they investigated this new territory. Across the road from where we had parked loomed an imposing sight. It was a wall of rock, smooth and formidable, rising at least as high as a 2-story house. The top was crowned with trees, their roots somehow finding purchase in the seemingly impenetrable stone. But what caught my eye was a huge crack that ran down the middle of this natural fortress, splitting it in two. "Look there," my mother pointed, her keen eyes spotting a detail I had missed. At the base of the crack, barely visible, was a crude stairway carved into the rock. It led upwards, disappearing into the shadows between the two halves of the mountain. A shiver ran down my spine, despite the warmth of the summer day. I had always been sensitive to the unseen, a trait that had led to several unsettling encounters in the past. Ghosts, spirits, or whatever you might call them, I had felt their presence before. Each time, it left me with an uneasy feeling, a creeping sensation that I was unwelcome, an intruder in spaces not meant for the living. As we approached the base of the rock face, that familiar feeling began to stir in the pit of my stomach. Yet curiosity overrode my apprehension. My father, ever the explorer, was already examining the rock stairway, testing its stability with his foot. "It seems solid enough," he declared, his voice echoing slightly in the confines of the crack. "Shall we see where it leads?" My mother nodded enthusiastically, already reaching for her camera. She had a passion for photography, always seeking to capture the essence of our travels. The dogs, sensing adventure, barked in agreement. With a deep breath, I followed my parents into the crack. The temperature dropped noticeably as we entered the shadow of the mountain. The walls on either side were close enough that I could touch both simultaneously if I stretched out my arms. Water trickled down in places, creating dark streaks on the rock face. As we ascended the crude steps, the feeling of unease grew stronger. It was as if unseen eyes were watching our every move, judging our intrusion. I wanted to tell my parents, to ask if we could turn back, but the words stuck in my throat. And then, about halfway up the stairs, I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a ray of sunshine somehow finding its way through the crack above. But as I blinked and focused, the image before me solidified into something both beautiful and terrifying. She stood on one of the higher steps, her form translucent yet radiant. It was as if she was made of pure light, with a soft orange glow emanating from her core. Her features were indistinct, but I could make out the curve of a smile and the gentle wave of a hand beckoning us forward. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see her?" My mother, who had been a few steps ahead, turned back. Her eyes widened as they fell upon the apparition. Without a word, she raised her camera and snapped a picture. The flash illuminated the narrow space for a split second, and in that moment, the ghostly figure seemed to shimmer and become even more defined. My father, who had been leading our ascent, hadn't noticed our pause. "Come on, you two," he called back, his voice echoing off the rock walls. "We're almost at the top." The ghost, for I was certain now that's what she was, continued to smile and wave. Despite every instinct telling me to turn and run, I found myself drawn towards her. It was as if she was pulling me forward with an invisible thread. Step by step I approached. The air around her was different, warmer, almost comforting. As I drew level with her, I could feel the heat radiating from her form, as tangible as the body heat of another person. It enveloped me, and for a moment, all my fear melted away. Then, in an instant, I passed through her. The warmth vanished, replaced by a chill that seeped into my bones. I gasped, spinning around, but the apparition had vanished. "Did you see that?" I asked my mother, my voice a mix of awe and fear. She nodded slowly, her face pale. I think I got it on camera," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We hurried to catch up with my father, who had reached the top of the stairs. As we emerged from the crack, we found ourselves on a small plateau surrounded by dense forest. The trees here were old, their gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. My father, oblivious to what had just transpired, was already exploring the area. "There's another path here," he called out, pointing to a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. My mother, still shaken by our encounter, suggested we take a break. We sat on some fallen logs, the dogs settling at our feet. As my parents unpacked our picnic, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we ate our lunch, the forest around us seemed to come alive. Birds called to each other in the canopy above, their songs intertwining in a complex melody. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the scent of wild mushrooms and damp earth. I tried to focus on my sandwich, but my mind kept replaying the encounter with the ghostly woman. Had she been trying to tell us something? Warn us? Or was she simply a remnant of a long-forgotten past, doomed to replay her final moments for eternity? My mother, sensing my unease, placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. I nodded, not trusting my voice. How could I explain the mixture of fear and fascination I felt? How could I put into words the warmth of the ghost's embrace, or the chill that followed? As if in response to my thoughts, a sudden gust of wind swept through our little clearing. It was unnaturally cold for a summer day, carrying with it whispers that seemed just on the edge of comprehension. Max and Luna whined, pressing closer to us. My father, ever the pragmatist, attributed it to the peculiar geography of the area. "Mountain weather," he said with a shrug. "It can change in an instant." But I knew better. This was no ordinary wind. It carried with it the weight of history, of lives lived and lost on this ancient mountain. As we finished our meal and packed away the remnants, my father's adventurous spirit reasserted itself. "Shall we explore that other path?" he suggested, pointing to the trail he had spotted earlier. My mother hesitated, glancing at me. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire to unravel the mysteries of this place warring with her maternal instinct to protect me from the unknown. In the end, curiosity won out. We set off down the narrow trail, the dogs leading the way, their noses to the ground as they investigated every new scent. The path wound its way through the dense forest, occasionally offering glimpses of the valley below through gaps in the trees. As we walked, the whispers I had heard earlier seemed to grow stronger. They were coming from all around us now, a cacophony of voices just below the threshold of understanding. Suddenly, Max and Luna stopped in their tracks, their ears perked and tails rigid. A low growl rumbled in Max's throat. "What is it, boy?" my father asked, peering into the gloom ahead. As if in answer, the whispers coalesced into a single clear voice. "Turn back," it said, the words carried on the wind. "This place is not for the living." My mother's face paled at the ethereal warning, her hand instinctively reaching for mine. My father, however, seemed more intrigued than frightened. His eyes scanned the forest around us, searching for the source of the voice. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rustling of leaves. My mother nodded slowly, her grip on my hand tightening. "Maybe we should head back," she suggested, her voice trembling slightly. But my father was already moving forward, his curiosity overriding any sense of caution. "It's probably just the wind playing tricks on us," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Come on, let's see where this path leads." Reluctantly, we followed him deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, obscuring what little sunlight managed to penetrate the canopy. The air grew colder with each step, and a fine mist began to swirl around our feet. The dogs whined softly, staying close to our heels rather than ranging ahead as they usually did. Their unease only added to the growing sense of dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the path opened up into a small clearing. What we saw there made us all stop in our tracks. "Oh my God!" my mother breathed, her free hand flying to her mouth in shock. Before us lay a forgotten graveyard, its weathered tombstones tilting at odd angles, half swallowed by the encroaching forest. Moss and lichen covered most of the stones, obscuring the names and dates carved into them. In the center of the clearing stood a crumbling mausoleum, its once grand facade now a shadow of its former glory. My father approached one of the nearest graves, brushing away the moss to reveal the inscription beneath. "These dates, some of these are hundreds of years old," he said, his voice filled with wonder. As he spoke, the mist seemed to thicken, swirling around the graves in an almost purposeful manner. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath our feet. "We shouldn't be here," I said, tugging on my mother's hand. "We need to leave." But even as the words left my mouth, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the doorway of the mausoleum was the glowing figure we had encountered earlier. Her orange light seemed dimmer now, tinged with sadness. She raised a translucent hand, beckoning us forward. My father, following my gaze, saw her too. "Incredible," he murmured, already taking a step towards the mausoleum. "No!" I cried out, but it was too late. As soon as my father's foot touched the threshold of the mausoleum, the world around us seemed to shift. The mist thickened instantly, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, and I felt as if I was being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. I clung to my mother's hand, terrified of being separated in this supernatural maelstrom. When the mist finally cleared, the world around us had changed. Gone was the decrepit graveyard, replaced by a bustling village square, The mausoleum had transformed into a grand church, its spire reaching towards a sky that was no longer obscured by trees. People in old-fashioned clothing hurried about their business, paying us no mind. What happened?" my mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where are we?" My father, his face a mask of awe and confusion, shook his head. "Not where," he said slowly. "When? I think we've somehow traveled back in time." As impossible as it seemed, I knew he was right. The sights, sounds, and even smells around us were from a different era entirely. The dog, still by our side, whined in confusion, pressing close to our legs. Before we could fully process what had happened, a commotion near the church caught our attention. A group of villagers had gathered, their voices raised in anger. At the center of the crowd stood a young woman, her clothes tattered and her face streaked with tears. "Witch!" one of the villagers cried out, pointing an accusing finger at the woman. "She's brought nothing but misfortune to our village." With a start, I realized that the accused woman was a younger version of the ghostly figure we had encountered. Her eyes, filled with fear and desperation, scanned the crowd, finally landing on us. For a moment, our gazes locked, and I felt a jolt of recognition pass between us. "Please," she called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the angry shouts around her. "I'm not a witch. I only wanted to help." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The crowd surged forward, rough hands grabbing at her clothes and hair. My father made a move as if to intervene, but my mother held him back. "We can't," she hissed. "We don't know what consequences our actions might have." Forced to watch helplessly, we saw the woman dragged towards a pyre that had been hastily assembled near the church. As the flames were lit, her eyes found mine once more. In that moment, I felt a wave of emotions that were not my own. Fear, sadness, but also a desperate hope. The scene before us began to shimmer and fade, the woman's anguished cries echoing in our ears as the mist enveloped us once more. As the spectral woman emerged from the mausoleum, her ethereal form seemed more solid than before. Her eyes, filled with centuries of sorrow, locked onto ours. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper on the wind, yet we heard it clearly. "You have seen the truth," she said. "You now carry the burden of my story." My father, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. "We want to help," he said. "Tell us how." The ghost's form flickered like a candle in a breeze. "My name was Elise," she began. "I was a healer, using the knowledge of plants and nature to cure ailments. But fear and ignorance turned my neighbors against me. They branded me a witch and took my life." As she spoke, the air around us seemed to thicken with emotion. I could feel her pain, her frustration, and her longing for justice. "All I ask is that my story be told," Elise continued, "that the truth of what happened here not be lost to time." My mother, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "We'll do more than that," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "We'll clear your name." The next morning we found ourselves in the local library of the nearest town. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margot, looked at us curiously as we explained our interest in the area's history, particularly focusing on witch trials. "Ah," she said, her eyes lighting up, "you must have visited the old graveyard in the forest. Not many tourists find that place." As Margot led us through the stacks, pulling out dusty tomes and faded manuscripts, we began to piece together the history of the region. The 17th century had been a time of great upheaval, with superstition and fear running rampant. There were several witch trials during that period, Margot explained, pointing to a particularly grim account. But one case always stood out to me, a young woman named Elise, known for her healing abilities. The records show she was accused of witchcraft after a bad harvest and a bout of illness in the village. My father leaned in, his eyes scanning the ancient text. "Does it say anything about the evidence against her?" Margot shook her head. "That's the curious thing. The records are frustratingly vague. It's as if someone wanted to obscure the details." As we delved deeper into the research, a pattern began to emerge. Elise had been popular among the common folk. her remedies often more effective than those of the official town physician. This had not sat well with some of the more powerful members of the community. "Look at this," my mother said, pointing to a faded letter she had discovered. "It's from the town physician to the magistrate. He's complaining about losing patients to a common hedge witch." The pieces were starting to fall into place. Elise hadn't been a witch at all, but a victim of jealousy and political maneuvering. Armed with our newfound knowledge, we approached the local historical society. At first they were skeptical of our claims, but as we presented the evidence we had uncovered, their interest grew. "This could change our understanding of that entire period," the society's president, Dr. Fournier, said as he pored over our notes. "If what you're saying is true, Elise's case could be a key to re-examining other witch trials in the region." Over the next few days, our quiet family vacation turned into a full-fledged historical investigation. My parents threw themselves into the research, coordinating with Dr. Fournier and his team. I found myself acting as a bridge between the present and the past, my sensitivity to the supernatural providing insights that the historians might have otherwise missed. As word of our investigation spread, more people came forward with family stories and heirlooms. A descendant of the town's former magistrate provided a diary that corroborated our theories about the political motivations behind Elise's trial. The ghost of Elise herself seemed to gain strength as we uncovered more of the truth. Her appearances became more frequent, and each time she seemed more at peace. 2 weeks after our fateful hike in the woods, we stood once again in the old graveyard. But this time, we weren't alone. A crowd had gathered, historians, local officials, and curious townspeople. Dr. Fournier stood at the front addressing the assembled group. "Thanks to the tireless efforts of this family," he said, gesturing to us, "we have uncovered a great injustice of our past. Elise was not a witch but a healer, wrongly accused and convicted. Today, we set the record straight." As he spoke, a team began the work of restoring Elise's grave, which had been unmarked for centuries. A new headstone was placed bearing her name and the truth of her story. As the ceremony concluded, I felt a familiar warmth beside me. Elise's spectral form appeared, more vibrant than ever before. Her face bore a smile of profound relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying on the wind. "You have freed me." With those words, her form began to fade, not into nothingness, but into a soft golden light that seemed to permeate the entire graveyard. As the light dissipated, I felt a sense of peace settle over the area, as if a great wrong had finally been righted. On our last night in Luxembourg, we sat around the campfire reflecting on the extraordinary events of the past few weeks. What had started as a simple family vacation had turned into a life-changing adventure. "I never thought I'd be part of uncovering a historical injustice," my father mused, poking at the fire with a stick. My mother nodded, her eyes distant. "It makes you wonder how many other stories like Elise's are out there, waiting to be told." As for me, I found myself grappling with my newfound understanding of my sensitivity to the supernatural. It wasn't a curse or something to be feared, but a gift that could bridge the gap between past and present, between the seen and unseen worlds. "What do we do now?" I asked, voicing the question that had been on all our minds. My parents exchanged a look. "Well," my father said slowly, "Dr. Fournier mentioned that there are similar cases in other parts of Europe. He suggested we might want to look into them." A thrill of excitement ran through me. The idea of more adventures, more mysteries to solve, more wrongs to right. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. "So, this is just the beginning?" I asked, unable to keep the eagerness out of my voice. My mother smiled, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "If that's what you want, sweetheart, we could make it a family mission." As we sat there, planning our next adventure, I realized that our encounter with Elise had changed us all. We had set out to explore the world, but in the process we had discovered a calling, to be the voice for those long silenced by history. The morning of our departure dawned bright and clear. As we packed up our car, the weight of our experiences settled around us like a comfortable cloak. We were no longer just tourists, but guardians of forgotten truths. Before leaving, we made one last trip to the graveyard. Standing before Elise's restored headstone, we each took a moment to say our private goodbyes. As I placed my hand on the cool stone, I felt a gentle warmth, a final acknowledgement from Elise. As we drove away from Luxembourg, the road stretching out before us seemed to hold infinite possibilities. My father had already begun researching our next destination, a small town in the Black Forest of Germany with its own tales of misunderstood witches. Looking out the window at the passing landscape, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. We had come to Luxembourg as a normal family on vacation and were leaving as something else entirely. Historians, investigators, and protectors of long-buried truths. The sun was high in the sky as we crossed the border into Germany. As the familiar excitement of a new adventure began to build, I realized that our true journey was just beginning. There were more stories to uncover, more wrongs to right, and more connections to be made between the past and the present. And as our car wound its way through the European countryside, I knew that wherever our path led us next, we would face it together. A family bound not just by blood, but by a shared mission to give voice to the voiceless and to shine a light on the shadows of history. Years have passed since that fateful summer in Luxembourg. What began as a chance encounter has blossomed into a lifelong pursuit. Our family has traveled across Europe, uncovering forgotten stories and bringing long-buried truths to light. Each case we investigate, each spirit we help to find peace, adds another thread to the rich tapestry of our shared history. We've learned that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in the stones of ancient buildings, in the whispers of the wind, and in the memories of those who have long since left this world. Our work has not always been easy. We've faced skepticism, opposition, and sometimes danger. But we've also found allies in the most unexpected places, historians eager for new perspectives, local communities rediscovering their heritage, and even descendants of those involved in past injustices seeking to make amends. As for me, my sensitivity to the supernatural has grown stronger with each passing year. I've learned to use it not just to communicate with spirits, but to read the emotional imprints left on places and objects. It's a gift that continues to guide us in our quest for truth. Tonight, as I write these words, we're camped at the edge of a forest in rural Romania. Tomorrow, we'll begin investigating reports of a shepherdess from the 18th century, wrongly accused of bringing a curse upon her village. Her story, like so many others, waits to be told. And so, our journey continues. With each story we uncover, each name we restore, we weave a connection between past and present, between the living and the dead. In doing so, we've discovered that history is not a fixed narrative, but a living, breathing entity that changes as we engage with it. As I close my journal and prepare for sleep, I can feel the whispers of the past swirling around our campsite. They no longer fill me with fear, but with a sense of purpose. For in listening to these long, silenced voices, in bringing their stories to light, we do more than correct historical records. We restore the humanity that was taken from them. And in this work, I've found my calling. For as long as there are untold stories and unresolved injustices echoing through time, our family will be there, ready to listen, to understand, and to share these tales with the world. The end, or perhaps just another beginning. Addiction took our mother slowly, rocked her through it, and sung her to sleep, sunk deep into the mattress on her bed. When her back teeth fell out, she left them on the side of the bathtub. I was 7, and I kept them in a matchbox. The the missing pieces of her kept safe so she wouldn't be lost forever. So maybe one day we could put her back together. Our house fell down around us, and we tried our best to raise ourselves. The ceilings had water damage, and the bottom stairs had dry rot, and in the winters the radiators would bleed rust. But it was still our house, and Annie made it a home. My sister Annie mothered me, with lopsided band-aids on bruised knees and lukewarm microwave meals. She told me ghost stories and didn't mind when I crawled into her bed later on, too scared to sleep alone. She taught me to dance, barefoot on the living room carpet, music channel on full volume on the TV, shaking our hips before they were fully grown. She always let me shower first, so the water was hot, never complaining when she had to make do with cold. She brushed my hair every day before school, even when I screamed and hit her when she caught the tangles. Annie was dark-haired like her father, whoever he had been, but I was blonde. Annie was desperate to be blonde too, like Marilyn Monroe, like Mom. I think she thought it would make them closer, remind Mom less of her dad. I'd give anything for her to have her hands in my hair one more time, even if it hurt. She moved to New York when I turned 18 and never came back. I still dream about her sometimes. Keeping up with our mother was impossible, and we learnt from a young age we would always be left behind. It didn't make it any easier. When she was drinking light, she shone, would wake us up at 3 a.m. with pancakes dripping in cherry syrup. Sometimes, when the weather was right and she'd had enough being drunk alone, she would call our school up and tell them we had both come down with summer sickness and we'd drive to the beach instead. I remember being 9 years old in the back seat of the car coming home after one of our ocean days, sucking the salt from my fingers. Annie had just dyed her hair blonde, her best friend Jane helping her bend over our kitchen sink. From behind, I couldn't tell who was mother and who was daughter, radio up and windows down, blowing the sky inside. When she was drinking heavy, she'd be out all night, hair piled up like a beauty queen, eyes glazed over and ringed with glitter and black. Sometimes she'd be gone a day or two. She would never tell us when. One day, we'd just wake up to an empty house and the fridge packed full, post-it note on the front with a smear of Mom's lipstick and the outline of a kiss, telling us she'd be back soon. Sometimes she'd bring guys home, filling the table with beer cans and ashtrays, smoke up to the ceiling, Mom lost in the haze. We'd sleep with pillows over our heads, trying to drown out the music they would blast until the a.m., and wake up to strangers at our kitchen table in the morning, asking us where we kept the coffee. When Mom drank too little, she fell apart. She wouldn't buy food, refrigerator a gaping hole in the wall. She'd chain smoke, leaving cigarette burns on the wallpaper up by the stairs like the walls were sick and decaying. She barely slept, walking around with blue half-moons under her eyes, knuckles raw. She would scream at the slightest thing. I remember once when I spilled a glass of juice on the couch. She looked over at me with dead eyes and dragged me off onto the carpet and then took every single cushion off the couch and into the backyard and set them on fire. Annie went to watch a while from the window and then sat next to me on the floor, backs pressed against the skeleton of the seats, head resting in the crater of my collarbones. When Mom drank too much was the worst. She'd laugh too loud and too long at anything and everything until her mouth started to shake and she started crying at the breakfast table into her cereal. Annie shut down when Mom was like this, went somewhere deep inside herself where nobody could hurt her. She'd stay up until the morning watching old black and white movies on TV, whispering the lines she knew by heart like prayers. When I was 5, I'd cry when I'd find Mom passed out cold on her bed, sure she would never wake up. Annie would wipe my tears, tell me she was only sleeping just like the princesses in my storybook. We'd sit on Mom's bed together and wait for her to wake up. When we were older, I was the one who would pick Mom up off the bathroom floor again and again, and Annie would put her to bed, smoothing her hair off her face and the vomit from her mouth, changing her clothes if she'd pissed herself. Watching them then, there was no doubt that Annie was the mother now. It was October, and I was 13, Annie 16. It was a Wednesday night, and Mom had been gone for 2 days. She'd called us that morning from a payphone, voice slurring down the line, telling us she was having the best time with all her new friends, hoped we were doing fine. When she asked me if I was having a good birthday, I hung up on her. My birthday had been the day before. Annie had given me a pile of presents, strawberry lip glosses, and glittery nail polishes. I didn't ask where she'd got the money for them. I didn't care. We'd taken the bus to the beach with Jane, eaten the birthday cake she had made for me, sand getting into the frosting. It tasted like sweetness and the sea, and I savored every bite and scrape of sugar against my teeth. We watched the sun go down, Annie snapping grainy photos on her shitty Nokia as I blew out my candles, wishing over and over that Mom wouldn't come home, that she'd just stay gone this time. But that Wednesday night, me and Annie weren't speaking. Anger hung heavy between us, seeping through the floorboards. It began when she tripped at the bottom of the stairs. We'd both laughed, Annie throwing her head back, gap between her front teeth catching the light. When I'd bent to pick her up, I'd caught her breath, warm against the freckles on my cheeks. I let go of her arms and she fell again, hitting the floor and grinning, shaking her hair from her face. Her breath was heavy with whiskey. I couldn't start picking her up too, couldn't watch her fall again and again. Just like Mom, I knew she'd never get back up. I'd stared down at her, blonde hair fallen into her eyes, and all I could see was our mother. And then I was running, feet slamming the hallway like heartbeats turned loose. I'd run for the kitchen and tipped every bottle we had down the sink, shoving Annie back as she fought to stop me, catching liquor on her fingers as it fell. She grabbed my shoulders and made me drop the very last bottle. It smashed between us on the floor, glass shards shining like we'd dragged the stars out of the sky and broken them, pieces we could never put back. Outside through the open windows, the sky turned pale gold, clouds a mess of pink and cream smeared across the horizon. I cried then, watching Annie on her knees picking up the pieces. That was Annie, always trying to fix things even when it was too late. The smell of food dragged me from my room, stomach turning traitor inside my ribcage. Annie was cooking pasta, real food not made in a microwave. She'd set the table, Tammy Wynette singing softly from the CD player, Annie gently swaying her hips as she stirred the tomato sauce, rich and warm. As we ate in silence, with every bite I forgave her. Mom never cooked dinner or remembered my favorite was spaghetti ever since I was a kid, or stayed sober long enough to sit up at a table. Annie wasn't Mom. We were washing the dishes when we first heard it. A moth was crawling down the inside of the pane, and I cracked the window to let it out into the dark. From the backyard came a faint sound. I tilted my head to listen as it was coming from far off, crying. I figured it was Mika, the 2-year-old next door, having a tantrum loud enough for us to catch, or maybe even Lucky Strike the cat that junkies down the street, begging for food like he sometimes did. I always wanted to feed him when he came around, winding over my ankles. But Annie always stopped me, saying once you started giving, they never stopped taking. Looking back, I don't think she was talking about the cat. Annie flipped the Christmas lights strung up around the porch, and we sat on the plastic beach chairs watching the skies. When we were little, we'd sit outside, and Annie would tell me the names of all the constellations and the stories of how they came to be hung up in the night sky. I had to grow up before I realized she made them all up as she went along. It was a game we still like to play now, making up ridiculous stories for the shapes we could pick out. Ah, yes, that one there is the Coors Light. It got there when God dropped it out of his convertible window and never picked it up, she said, nodding sagely and hiding her smile. Of course, I said, waving my hands and pointing up past the power lines, right next to the ashtray, left there by angels on a smoke break. Yeah, they say if you wish on it, all your dreams will come true, said Annie, grinning. She stopped laughing, voice quieter, face tilted up to all those dead stars. Let's wish Emmy. Let's wish. So we did. The sound of crying interrupted us. It was closer this time and definitely human. We turned to each other, confused. Annie shrugged and I squinted out into the black. It sounded like a baby, lost and tired and alone. "It must be Mika," I said, slowly getting to my feet. "Maybe he walked around the back? Shit, do you want to call Connie and tell her we'll bring him over?" Annie didn't reply and I sighed, rolling my eyes. "Guess I'll do everything then." I stepped off the porch, grass soft against my heels. The air smelled like it might rain, fresh and clean and growing. A promise unfulfilled. Annie's voice was strained. I turned to her, smiling. It died on my face when I saw the look on her own. Get inside now." She was staring out into the dark, past me, opening the door with one hand behind her, fingers fumbling on the catch. I froze, barefoot in the dirt. I'd found what she was looking at. In the bushes by the back fence was a person, crouched with their knees tucked up neat under the chin, arms wrapped around legs. Their mouth hung wide, softly opening and closing as he cried, like a child lost in the dark. Not like a child, but as someone pretending, mimicking the sound, open and closed out in the blackness. Suddenly they straightened, snapping upright, face still hidden by the black. They were tall and thin, too thin to be a normal person. Panic made me move, animal instincts left over from the days we lived up in the trees carrying me forward. I was faster than Annie, dragging her inside and slamming the door behind us, hearing it bounce on its hinges as I locked it. We watched as the person slowly walked towards the house, steps deliberate and long. Annie reached for my hand, holding me tight, and turned me to face her, holding my shoulders. "Don't turn around, Emmy, don't turn around." Instinctively, I started to look over my shoulder out into the darkness. Annie grabbed my face hard and shook her head. I knew then she was serious. Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat, gripping my hand tight enough to hurt, nails digging in, grounding herself. I looked down at our fingers interlocked, both of us grown from the same bones. "I'm going to call the cops and everything is going to be—" Her voice faltered, stuttering. Tears spilled over her lashes, dripping like the promise of rain. Annie never cried. "Your phone's on the porch," she whispered, and bile crawled its way up my throat. Her phone was upstairs, charging. A soft tap-tap-tapping filled the silence. Annie turned to the window, eye whites showing her eyes were so wide. It was the sound of someone's forehead against the glass, slowly, over and over. They started to speed up, faster and harder, skin meeting glass until they were slamming into the window hard enough to shake the panes. The tapping stopped, and I was about to ask Annie if I could look now when she screamed, followed by the sound of cracking glass and the loudest slam yet. Whoever was in our yard had just smashed their face hard enough into the window to break it. We ran upstairs, two at a time, skipping the ones caved in with dry rot on instinct. I turned behind me once, and Annie yanked my face back before I could see. The sound of broken glass echoed behind us as we made it to the bathroom, locking the door. A thin, wailing cry, like a baby calling for its mother, filled the hallway, trapped between the walls and locked doors. Annie threw her back against the door, feet jammed up against the bathtub, clutching the knife she had grabbed from the kitchen. I did the same, shoulder to shoulder. Slow footsteps started on the stairs, deliberate and casual. The crying had become mocking, almost laughter, shrill bursts of sound and then giggles, high-pitched and abruptly stopping before starting again. The first door on the upstairs floor was my bedroom, and we heard the distinct sound of it slamming open. They were looking for us. "What the fuck is going on?" I asked Annie, not even bothering to brush away the tears that I couldn't stop falling. I watched my sister pick herself up off the floor and brace her hands on the door as we heard the sound of a second door slamming open. Mom's room. The next room on the hallway was the bathroom. Annie pulled me to my feet and handed me the knife. I shook my head and pushed it back to her, terrified of what would happen if I had to use it. Annie shoved me and pressed the knife into my hands, thumb pressing hard enough on the blade to bleed. I watched my sister's blood drip down her wrist, a winding red road still pushing into my hands despite the pain. I took the knife. Something slammed against the wall that Mom's room shared with the bathroom. A high-pitched wail followed. I held my breath, could feel my heart beat in the base of my throat, a wild and frantic thing. "I'm going to get the phone from my room." I shook my head violently, about to argue. Annie clamped a hand over my mouth. I could taste the blood on her hand, salty and sweet, like birthday cake by the ocean. "Yes, I'm going to get the phone and I'm going to call the cops and we're going to be okay." I shook my head again. "It's the only way. When I go, I need you to lock the door and you don't open it for anything or anyone. Not for me, not for anyone. Promise me." I shook my head and Annie pressed her hand into my mouth, crushing my teeth against my lips so it made my eyes water. "Yes, promise me, Em." Something smashed in the room next door. Annie brushed the hair off my face, gently tucking it behind my ear. "Promise," she mouthed, and unlocked the door as slowly as possible, bolt scraping gently. I watched the curve of her shoulder disappear into the black hall outside, like the moon in eclipse. And then she was gone. I couldn't move or breathe for a second, and then I slammed the bolt shut just as something bounced off the outside of the door. A high-pitched scream followed, handle rattling up and down hard enough to pop one of the screws. I watched it roll towards me on the tiles, and then silence. I sat with my back to the door, holding the knife and wishing I was holding Annie's hand instead. Still silence. Nothing but me and my lungs slowly filling the room with my breath. "Em?" came a voice through the door. I started, hands gripping the knife. "Honey, what's going on?" "Mom?" My voice cracked. "Mama, is that you?" I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking, trying to keep myself still. "Sweetie, it's okay. Just open the door. It's okay, just let me in." The handle rattled again, gentler. "Just let me in. It's all okay." She banged on the door and I took my handle of the bolt. "Honey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed your birthday. I'm sorry I'm such a terrible mother. Please." Her voice broke and she started to cry. "Just let me in, baby. I'm so sorry." I screwed my eyes shut. She sounded so sad and so lost. I just wanted her to hold me like when I was a kid and I'd come in off the swings with a scraped knee. Maybe this time she meant it. Maybe it would all be okay. My hand found its way to the bolt again. My sister's voice came through the door, warm and gentle. "Yeah, Emily let us in. It's all okay." My hand froze on the bolt and I tightened my grip on the knife. Annie never called me by my full name. A hand banged on the door, handle rattling. "Emily, let us in." Annie's voice became low and guttural, followed by the same shrill giggles from before. Mom spoke now, pleading and crying, voice getting louder and louder. "Let us in! Let us in! Let us in!" over and over again, punctuated by her fists on the door. I thought about demons and monsters. All the bedtime stories we pray don't crawl out from under the bed. "That's not my sister and you're not my mother!" I screamed through the door, hands over my head. I climbed into the bathtub and curled in a ball, cradling myself, knife clutched to my chest. I didn't know what it was outside that door, but I knew it wasn't Annie. It wasn't the voice that yelled at when I changed TV channel, the one that sang me happy birthday, the one that told me I was smart even when I got bad grades, the one that read me stories about princesses that never wake up. It wasn't human. Bangs and yells came from downstairs, followed by the footsteps of people running. A low, guttural howl ripped through the house, filling the room until I felt like I was drowning in the sound, and then the door was kicked in. I screamed, covering my eyes, waiting to die. Arms found me and lifted me from the tub, carrying me from the room. I looked at the outside of the door as I was carried downstairs. It was covered in long, scraping claw marks dragged down to the floor. Pillows ripped apart covered the hallway in soft down, like it had snowed inside. I watched them drift slowly as men in uniforms checked each of the rooms that looked like they had been torn apart by something feral. Outside in our driveway were police cars and an ambulance. In the middle of it all was Annie, bathed in blue and red light as it washed over her, lit up in the dark like a neon angel, face aglow. I threw myself from the cop's shoulder and ran to her, holding us both together, broken pieces and all, standing under all those constellations we made up. Gentle screaming came from the ambulance, which rocked occasionally. Annie gently turned my head away, smiling so sadly it made my chest ache as I understood. Turns out there was no demon, no wild animal or bad men trying to break in. Just Mom, out of her mind on booze and drugs and everything in between, coming to the end of a week-long binge. Something had finally broken inside her head, and this time we couldn't put her back together no matter how hard we tried. Sometimes you fall one last time, and you never get back up. Annie had seen her in the garden, blood dribbling from her mouth, track marks bulging on her forearms like unmapped roads, rail thin and desperate for one more hit, one more fix. She'd searched the kitchen for all the drink I'd thrown away, and when she hadn't found it, had come to hunt for the stash she hid in the bathroom. She hadn't wanted me, just the drugs on the other side of the door, so high she could mimic Annie's voice almost perfectly. Turns out the real monsters are the ones that eat you alive slowly. The kind that come in a bottle or a needle, or at the end of a long list of reasons why you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes the monsters are the ones that raise you or love you the most, but it's up to you if you let them in. I'm a 17-year-old girl who would babysit for a family I knew extremely well. My younger sister was friends with the little boy from the family. We'll call him Chris for privacy reasons. I absolutely adored Chris's younger sister Lily, which is the main reason their mother had asked me to babysit for them. I was honestly excited as I really enjoyed spending time with both kids. Their mom was going out to dinner with friends, and she wouldn't be home until much later in the night. The night of babysitting approached, and everything had been fine. I'd been playing some Minecraft with the two of them for quite a while, and later ordered a pizza for us all to share. Eventually 9 p.m. approached, and it was the kids' bedtime. The excitement must have wiped them out because they didn't fight me at all. Once they were both asleep in their rooms, I sat on the couch in the living room and watched Netflix. For context, behind the living room is the staircase which leads to upstairs. So from where I was sitting, even though my back was facing it, I could see if someone was standing on the staircase. I was about halfway into an episode of my show when I then heard footsteps descending down the stairs. Assuming it was either Chris or Lily, I called out both of their names. No answer. Either I imagined it or it was just one of them getting up to use the bathroom or something. I continued to watch my show until I saw something in the reflection of the grandfather clock. Right next to the TV, there was a faint outline of a little girl leaning over the railing of the stairs. I wasn't panicked at all initially, as I figured it was just Lily who had woken up. I turned from the couch to look at the stairs, only to be met with an empty staircase. There was nobody there. I whipped my head back around to face the grandfather clock, and the reflection was gone. I felt my stomach plummet, and my heartbeat started to spike. Unnerved, I paused the TV and looked back at the staircase. Nothing. Maybe the reflection had just been from the TV, and this was all in my head. That was the only plausible explanation. The only way I was going to find out for sure was if I checked both kids. Reluctantly, I got up and I walked up the staircase. I opened the door to Chris's room to find him sound asleep. I then made my way over to Lily's room, only to find her asleep as well. I walked further into her room just to double-check if she was really fully asleep, and she was. My heart still racing. I was just baffled. What the hell had I seen in the reflection, if Lily was genuinely asleep? I turned to leave the room, only to stop dead in my tracks. There was a girl standing in the hallway, a girl who definitely wasn't Lily. She was sickeningly pale and wearing a white nightgown. I felt like my heart was going to come up my throat, frozen in fear. It took a few seconds to come back to reality and then slam the door and lock it. My heart is pounding so fiercely I feel like I'm going to puke. I just stood there, leaning against the door for a solid minute, heart racing and breathing heavy. That's when I then heard a knock on the door, and I jumped screaming bloody murder. "Hey, it's just me," I heard Chris say from the other side of the door. Instant relief washed over me as I opened the door to see Chris. He just stood there, eyes wide, with this absolutely unnerved expression, clutching his little creeper stuffed animal. "What's wrong?" he asked me quietly. Lily had woken up as well, sitting up in bed with a confused expression. I didn't want to scare either of them, and little kids will panic if they see an adult actually freaked out. So I lied. "I was just watching a scary movie downstairs," I tell them. "When I came up to check on you guys, I guess I was just caught off guard. Sorry for waking you." They both went back to bed, and I returned back downstairs to try and become calm again. I resumed my TV show, and I was reaching the end when I suddenly had the urge to look in the reflection once again. Big mistake. I looked back only to see the clear face of a young girl, the one from the hallway, gaunt black eyes boring straight into me. Without another thought, I immediately sprung off the couch and sprinted up the stairs. I scooped Lily up out of bed and yanked Chris out of his. I fumbled for my car keys out of my bag, my hands shaking and my mind yelling a million different things at me. I booked it for my car. I don't even remember if I looked down the driveway before peeling out and speeding towards my home. Chris and Lily slept in the guest room in my house that night. I texted the mother that their house had lost power that night, so I had taken them to mine. My family was super close to theirs, so I didn't think it would be a big deal. When she came to pick them up, their mother asked me to babysit again, but I turned her down politely. It's not that I didn't like the kids. There was just no way in hell I was going to deal with that again. A few weeks later, my sister was invited for a play date with Chris. My parents, their mom, and I were all eating lunch together when Chris and Lily's mom brought up she was looking into moving. She started to complain hearing weird noises and seeing things by the staircase. Shock hit me like a bucket of cold water. Their mom continued on, explaining that she went to go do research on the house and had come across some unsettling things. During the 1920s, a family with 2 daughters lived there. Their youngest had died of pneumonia, and her bedroom was Lily's. Previous owners of the house had complained of the same things. I wasn't crazy, but I would be if I ever went back into that house again. Let me start by saying that my family has always had a knack for sensing spirits and other entities, especially my mother. She realized she could sense things when she was about 15, but that's another story for another time. This story starts back in the 90s when I was 11 years old. Me, my mother, and my older brother, who was 13 at the time, lived out in the boonies on a 5-acre plot of land in central Indiana. Our house sat roughly 50 yards back from the road, and behind it was a 2-story garage, a pond with a shed, and behind that was an old wooden shack with a patch of woods behind that to finish out our land. When we initially moved in, my mother told us to stay out of that shack because we were going to use it for any excess trash we had or any trash that was too big to be put out at the road, and raccoons and other animals would most likely be out there. So we didn't. We had all that land to roam around and play. We didn't need to mess around in there. We had plenty of other things we could do. So a little time passes with us living in this house, and we start to experience your typical ghostly encounters like footsteps or gusts of wind where there shouldn't be, things like that. My mother told us not to worry, it was only the ghost of a little girl that had drowned in the pond out back years ago, and to not worry about her, she's harmless. My mother even gave her a name. We called her Libby. Now, Libby would do to us what your typical little girl would do, like poke us and run around the corner and hide. Things little kids do when they play. I was so young at the time that it always kind of scared me, but my mother would reassure me that everything is fine and not to worry. There was only one time that I ever actually seen Libby, and to this day this memory is etched into my brain. It was about a year into us living there when this happened. Me and my cousin, let's call him Tyler. Me and Tyler were in the game room playing GameCube one night. Now the game room had a big glass window that looked out into the backyard and the pond. So, as we were playing video games, I just happened to glance out the window and I see what looks like a little girl that couldn't be more than 5 years old standing under the pond light with her back to the house staring out at the pond. She had jet black hair and was wearing a white dress with red polka dots, and she had a little red bow in her hair. By this time, I've had enough encounters to know that if this is a ghost and if I look away, there's a good chance it will disappear when I look back. So without taking my eyes off of her, I pause the game and tell Tyler to get up and look to make sure what I was seeing was actually there. Now Tyler doesn't know about the Libby situation, so when he looks, he's not expecting to see a little girl standing there. So he starts freaking out, asking me who that is. Why is she out there in the middle of the night? Where are her parents? Things like that. All very reasonable questions. As he's asking me, the little girl slowly starts to turn around to look back at the house, and as soon as I am about to see her face, boom, she disappears. That was it for us that night. We turned the game off, laid down, and watched a funny movie to help us go to sleep. Now, fast forward another year or so, and we have become so accustomed to Libby that it doesn't bother any of us anymore. One summer day while my mother is at work, me and Tyler are outside fishing and catching garter snakes and just overall being adventurous on our property. We decide that after me living here as long as I have and never even taking a peek inside that old shack, that we should go check it out. So we make the small hike back to the shack and we go in. When we open the door and go inside, there's some trash in there, but not a whole bunch like we thought. What was in there was an old wooden bed frame, a wooden dresser, and what looked like a little wooden baby crib that neither of us had ever seen before. They were very old and almost looked handmade. Now Tyler and I, being the rambunctious teenage boys we were, figured that all these things were just trash like everything else in there, so we started throwing stuff around and breaking things and just tearing stuff up. Boys being boys. After we had our fun, we went back inside to get drinks and hang out. Once my mother got home from work, she immediately barged in the front door so mad that she was yelling at us before she even got through the door, asking us why we went out messing around in that shack and what did we do. At the time, we didn't understand how she knew because that had been hours ago and she was in a completely different town at work. But nonetheless, she knew and she was irate. So we apologized and offered to go clean it up, but she told us to just leave it alone and stay inside. After that day, we never heard or felt Libby again, and I started to become very depressed and started having real trouble controlling my emotions. At first, I just figured it was me going through puberty because I was at that age. But after about a week or two of this, I started feeling like everywhere I went, I was being watched, and not in a protective way. Each day it got worse and worse until one night I was in bed watching my TV about to go to sleep, and I kept getting this feeling like I wasn't alone. So I look over at the sliding closet door in my bedroom. Now, the sliding door was broken so it wouldn't shut all the way, and when I looked over, all I could see was a pair of red eyes. Not like glowing red eyes either, like a dark, barely able to see red eyes just staring at me. No figure, no body, just eyes. And it terrified me to that point that I started sleeping in the living room and couldn't go in my bedroom anymore. About 6 months after this happened, we moved out of that house, and it took my mother years to tell me what actually happened that day and how she knew about the shack. What she told me was the very first day we moved there, she sensed something evil connected to that shack. That's why she told us to leave it alone. And once I went out and destroyed that bed frame and that baby crib, whatever evil was out there moved into my bedroom, and we moved because my mother was afraid of what was happening to me because of it. Back then, I didn't make the connection, but looking back, I realized what happened. Now, I'm telling this story because ever since we lived in that house, not only have I developed my own sense of feeling for these things, but also every house I've ever lived in since then, I have had continuous, unexplainable paranormal activity happen. Even the house I live in now, 20 years later, as a grown man with children of my own. every apartment, every house, every building I've lived in has had these issues. And it makes me wonder, has whatever that thing was I angered as a child been following me for the past 20 years, tormenting me at every stop? Was there ever really a Libby? Or was it that thing posing as an innocent child to infiltrate our family and feed off of our energy? I guess it's up to me to find out.